Hey everyone, I'm going to be doing a recitation walking through the Team Builder project from yesterday. This is a really interesting project because we have a lot of potential ways to solve this, and editing is a hard problem. So we're going to see the solution that I chose, which is going to involve routes, but there's a lot of other ways to do this, and there's a lot of ways to adapt some of the principles that I'm showing here into your own solution. And if I have time, I'll cover as much of those as possible. So the first step on this project is creating our React app, which is something we haven't had to do before. I've already done it because I don't want to spend the time necessary to install those dependencies here. I kind of feel like a chef who is, put the dish in the oven on television and then takes the completed dish out of another oven immediately. Um, so what I've done here is I've cloned my project, and in my terminal we can see I've already created the React app. And if I hadn't done that, there's a couple different commands I could run. The first is create React app, and then the name I want to give it. When you run this command, it will download all the dependencies and set up, the JSON files and everything needed to get your React app up and running. But if you run this, you might get an error saying create React app is not a recognized command. That just means it's not installed on your computer. Create React app is an npm package, so we could install it with yarn global add create React app, or we could use another command called npx. npx lets us download and run npm packages on the fly. So we could use npx create React app, and then the name we want to give our React app. If for some reason that's not doing it for you, Yarn also has the ability to do this. We can do yarn create, and this will allow us to run a subset of npm packages that are dedicated to creating different types of applications. So we do yarn create space, this isn't a typo, React app, and then the name we want to give our application. One of those should probably work for you. If it doesn't, then reach out to me. But for now, I've already done that, and it's in my Team Builder folder. So I'm going to navigate there, and then I'm going to run yarn start. And that's going to go ahead and open up in my browser. And I've finally fixed it so that it does run in Firefox instead of Chrome. And here we go. I've taken the liberty of prepping this just a little bit, deleting that service workers file and the logo because I don't want to use them. But before I write a single line of code, I want to start with the most valuable tool we have available to us in programming, which is a pen and a piece of paper. Now it's hard for me to show you that, so I just have a drawing application open on my screen. If we're stuck with a project and we don't really know how to approach it, an absolutely vital tool for us is to pop into our browser, or pop into a drawing application or a blank sheet of paper, grab a pen, and just kind of write out what we're doing. I usually do this when I start every project. And so what do we want to do here? Well, the idea is that we have an application that's going to render a list of team members, and then we're going to have a form that's going to add members to that team, and our next step is then to have that form be able to edit existing members. For now, I'm going to plan out displaying our team members and adding to it, and then we'll worry about grafting editing onto this. One of the great features of React is that when we write these reusable, composable components, that we can modify their behavior later after we've kind of started. So I already know I'm going to have two components. I'm going to have one, and I'm going to call this card for simplicity, and this is going to render a person. I'm going to have another component that is going to be my form. and that is going to add a person. Awesome. So then I can start thinking about what I want my app to do. It's going to have to enclose both of these. So it's going to be my app. And this is also going to require some state. This is where we're going to keep track of our array of team members, which I'm going to call people. And then we're going to have a corresponding function, set people. So to render these cards, we're going to map over people and then render all of these individual components. With our form, we're also going to have some state, and that's going to be the individual person that we are constructing within our form. But the action we want to happen in this component when it submits is to add the person. So in order to do that, this is going to need access to this set people function, because that's what is going to allow us to modify our array full of the person objects. So that's how we pass data from this lower level component to this higher level one, because we can't pass, props up. Props only go down. But we can use functions to create this kind of life cycle where we pass the function down and then we give it the person as an argument, and then that is going to allow us to change the value of people. So this is the basic structure of my app that I want to approach. App with the array of objects in it, our card, our form. So why don't we get started? Inside of app.js, I have essentially nothing. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write my card component. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to create a directory called components, and then in there I'm going to make card.js. I'm going to set this up like all of our React components. Import React from React. We're going to declare this component function. It's going to take in some props, and then we're going to export that function. Now, what is my person object going to look like? Well, I'm going to rough that out right now. We need 3 pieces of data according to the document. We're going to need a name, we're going to need an email, and we are going to need a role. And those are all going to be strings. So I'm going to assume that this card is going to receive one of these person objects as a prop. So I'm going to declare that as a variable. I'm going to get my person object out of my props, which I can do like this. Person is equal to props.person. I can also do it like this using destructuring, which is my preferred way of doing this. Now, for the sake of efficiency here, I'm just going to make this really ugly. I'm just going to render the person's name, their email, and their role. Awesome. Now, let's test this in our app. One of the things I want to do is I want to start rendering my components as soon as I can to try to catch any errors I've made. So I'm going to import card from a relative path from in app.js. So that's going to be ./components/card.js. And then I'm going to render my card. And immediately we run headlong into an error. And it's telling me person is undefined. And that's because it isn't defined. The error messages aren't lying to us. This card component expects a prop called person, and I didn't give it to it. So let me hard code in a person right here. It's going to be an object with a name. Let's make it me. Let's put my email in there. And let's give me a role. Now that object is defined, I show up right there at the top. Let me get rid of the initial app here. Alright, but I don't want to just render a single card. I want to render a card for every member of my team. And I'm going to need to change the members of those teams. So I'm going to create a stateful variable. So I need to import useState from React. And then now I'm going to declare, I'm going to call it people. I like, making the plurals here. I'm calling this a person. So I'm calling this people. I could also call it, team member and team members, but this is a little less typing. So we have our corresponding set people function, and then we're going to use useState. And we know this needs to be an array of objects. For the sake of having some stuff show up on the screen, I'm going to give it a couple objects to start. I'll give it me, and I'll also give it my dad, Bard Belvins. And he's going to be a dad. So now I need to create cards for each one of these objects. This is a perfect use case for map. We can use map to turn these objects into components. So I'm going to do people.map. I'm going to take in each person, and then I'm going to create a card component, and I'm going to give it that person as a prop. So now I see me and my dad showing up right there. Does anyone have any questions so far? Yes, this is being recorded, and it will be posted on YouTube as soon as we're done. All right, I see some typing happening. So we can determine we needed a card based on the README. And so our minimum viable product is to render a list of team members from state. Does it tell us how to do this? No. Does it tell us what to call that component? No. I just chose to call it a card because that's terminology we've already seen, where we're taking in an object full of data and we're rendering it into, a box on our screen. And I could style it to look like a card, but that's not necessary. Virginia asked why I don't have a card list component. That's absolutely something that I could do, and I just chose not to do it. We could break this out into its own component. I could write this entire thing right in app.js, and we, wouldn't have any functional issues as far as our app was concerned. But it's better practice to break our stuff up into components. For the sake of simplicity here, I'm just doing this one-line map, and I'm not worried about placing that in its own component, but you can absolutely do that as well. All right, I'm seeing some more typing. And while I'm waiting for those questions, our next step is to try to get our form component going. So I'm just going to try to make this in a void where I have a form and I can type into it and we can see if that works. Why not make the form first, Levon asks. Because I didn't. Again, it doesn't really matter the order in which we do this. React is not opinionated about this. I chose to get my cards going first because that way it would force me to think about the shape of my data and also get something on my screen. So I figured it was probably faster to write the card component than the form component, and I want to get feedback as fast as I can about how I'm doing. Because writing this card may have forced me to realize, oh, there's certain things I hadn't considered before, without dedicating, infrastructure in this more complicated form component that I might have to go and rewrite. But let's do the form now. So inside of my components directory, I'm going to create a file called form.js. I'm going to import React, and I'm also going to import useState because I know I'm going to use it later from React. I'm going to define the component function, form. This is going to take in some props, and I am going to export form. I'm also going to have it return something. So now I want to write a form. So I'm going to open up a form tag in here, and I'm going to declare my 3 inputs. I'm going to give them some placeholders, just so in the background it tells me what they're for. We're going to do name, we're going to do email, and we're going to do role. And we don't see anything yet, because I'm not rendering this component to app. It's important, JavaScript will parse this file to make sure it's syntactically correct, but it won't run it until we render it somewhere. In the same way that when we define a function, we don't run that code until we invoke the function. Components are functions. We invoke them when we render them. So to get this on my screen, I'm going to need to import it into app. So I'm going to import my form from /components and form.js. Now I'm going to add that right above my map of person cards. There we go. I see my form. And that's a little bit ugly. I'm going to just do some inline styling here. Should I do this in my CSS file? Probably. You know what? I'll actually do that instead of inline styles. So let's go ahead and open up app.css. I'm going to target my form. I'm going to give it display flex, flex direction column, and a max width of 500 pixels. And then I'm also going to center it 10 pixels on the vertical margin. There we go. That's looking a little bit better. And let's give these inputs a little bit of spacing. Let's do 10 pixels, 0 here. Alright, let's make it 5 pixels. Can't forget about our styling. That looks a little bit nicer. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my form, and we're going to see if this works. I can type in these, and it works! Amazing! We don't necessarily have to use manage input in our forms where we're setting them equal to variables, but it sure makes it a heck of a lot easier when we need to go out and collect that data for another purpose. So we're going to set that up now. So in here, I'm going to create a stateful component, or a stateful variable, that is going to hold the person that I'm creating in this form. So I'm going to call it person. And I'm going to get my setPerson function. We're going to call useState, and we're going to give it the initial value here. We have to give these some initial values, because when we set later input equals something down here, if we give it undefined, React isn't able to tell if we actually set the value of this prop to be undefined, or if it wasn't set, because in the props object, when we do props, some key that doesn't exist, that's going to be undefined by default. So we have to make sure that we're giving this input a value. Otherwise, we're going to get a message in our console that says something about us, like relinquishing control over this input. That's usually what that means, is that the value you're giving it as input is undefined. So I want to make some default values here. We know the shape of our data. We're going to have a name. It's just going to be an empty string. Same with the email, and same with the role. And now I can give these as, I'm sorry, I call this input. This should be value. Now I'm going to give the value to my input from this variable. So this is going to be person.name. We're going to be person.email here. And we're going to be person.role. Awesome. So now those are set, but when I type, nothing happens. It's because I've set them equal to these variables, person name, email, role, and those right now are always going to be empty strings. So this is where we have to work in the onChange function, which is an event that's going to fire whenever we type in there to set the values of these variables. So now we get this somewhat awkward life cycle where we type into the form, it triggers an event, which then sets the value of the form, which seems unnecessary because isn't that how an input normally works? But this allows us to have easy access to this person object wherever we need it instead of trying to grab values out of this form. And then later, if we need to set their values, we also have a place where we can do that very easily. So, managed forms generally a bit annoying to set up until you get that down, but once you do, it makes the rest of your life as a dev a lot easier when you're working with these forms. So the way we're going to write our onChange function is we're going to give it a prop, onChange, and it's going to be equal to the event handler that we want. It's going to take an event in as an argument, and in here we can do whatever we need to do. In this case, event.target.value is going to be the value of whatever we've just attempted to type into the input. So we can set the corresponding field in this person object to be event.target.value. And I can do that manually. Set person, and I want to use my existing person object. I'm going to spread it into this new object, which is going to copy all of its old keys and values. And then I'm going to set the value for name. When we do this kind of spread operation, where we're copying an old object into a new object, and then we give another value for a key like name, the new object is going to take the rightmost value for that key. So even though we have name defined within here, within person, the object is going to end up using the value for name that we set over to the right. So I'm going to set this to be event.target.value. Now, if I come over here, I can type within name. I can type, and we trigger this onChange function, which is going to set the value of name to be event.target.value. But it still doesn't work for email, and it also doesn't work for role. I could copy and change this function for each of them, but this is another smell test that we should be developing, right? Our intuition should tell us that if I'm copying and pasting these functions, there should be a way for me to do it programmatically. There should be a cleaner solution that's going to allow me to write less code, which makes my code easier to maintain, to read, and to reason about. The way we do that is we're going to define a function up here, and we're going to call it handleChange. And this is going to take in the event, and this is going to be the function that we're going to give to onChange for all of our inputs. So what we want to do is we want to do setPerson, and we want to take our old value of the person, and then we want to add something, the appropriate key, with the appropriate value, which we know is going to be event.target.value. What we can do is we can set a prop on these inputs called name. I'm going to set this to be name. And we can reference that variable via event.target.name. And it's going to give us the value of that prop. And we can use that as the name of our key that we're setting by wrapping it inside of square brackets. So if I do event.target.name in here, it'll grab the name of my variable and use that as the name of this key. As opposed to, if I did event.target.name here, I'm going to get an error because before the colon it expects a string. But if I use my square brackets, it's going to let me use the value of this variable. We can think of this like if I have an object and I, get some key out of it, I can't use a variable here because it's going to treat it like the literal value of the name of that key. If I want to use the value of the variable, I can do object square brackets and then whatever my variable is. Levon, exactly. Those square brackets are not related to arrays. We use these symbols in a lot of different contexts where they mean different things, and it's more closely related to what I've done here, where we're accessing the key in object with the variable var, using these brackets as our accessor operator. And here, I can use those square brackets to use the value of a variable as the name of this key. So now what I can do is I can set this onChange prop to be handle change. And this is going to take in the event, and it's going to go and it's going to set the value of this name key. And I can add these props to each of these. I'm going to set name here equal to email. I guarantee at some point you're going to write this, because we did name equals name up here. You're going to try to write email equals email, especially if you're trying to do a find and replace. So make sure this is name equals email. And then we can set the onChange to be our handle change function. And we can set the name of our role to be role, and the onChange to be our handle change function. So now I can type in each of these, and they're going to update the correct value associated with those. And that's awesome. We saw in lecture today, this is a great potential use case for a custom hook, where we have this functionality closely associated with an existing hook, useState, where we can write this into our own custom hook and then use this in as many different form components as we want. But for here today, I'm going to stick with this. All right, so we have our form working. We can type in the values for our name, our email, and our role, but we want this form to do something when we submit it. The way we can do that is we can add a button to this form. I'm going to make this button say add person. Now we set the type of this button equal to submit. That means when I click on this button, it's going to fire a submit event for this form, which by default does some weird stuff. If I click this, it's going to refresh our page, and it's also going to add these query parameters to our URL. That's not what I want to do. So I'm going to have to add my own event handler on submit, prevent the default behavior of this event, and then do whatever I want with it. So
Yeah, Henry?
yes, Amir, what's up?
Yeah, so if you don't put the type equals submit on your button and the button is still in a form element, isn't the default behavior of that button to submit anyways?
Let's see. It is. Yep.
Okay.
That works.
Checking.
I prefer to be explicit here. You know, I want to read this and be like, this is the button that triggers the submission. And we can set this type value on other elements and forms, and they do interesting things. Like I can set the type on this input to be email. Now watch what happens if I try to submit this. It tells me I need to put in an email address, and the parsing isn't, you know, exhaustive. It'll just accept anything with an @ symbol in it. But we can use these type values to make our various elements inside of our form do different things. We might not always want, you know, a button to submit. We might have multiple buttons that perform different actions. So I like to be explicit with my type values. So now I need to write my onSubmit handler for this form. So I'm going to write a function. Let's call it handleSubmit. It's going to take in an event. And for now, I'm just going to have it prevent the default behavior of the event so it doesn't refresh our page and mess with our URL. And then I'm going to have it console log the person object we so painstakingly constructed. And I'm going to give this to the form as a prop called onSubmit. And now, let me fix my URL. Open up my console. If I go in here, and I give it some junk data, and click Add Person, we're going to see that object ready and waiting for us to do things with it. That's perfect. We had to jump through these hoops to get it set up, but now I don't have to worry about it. This person variable is always going to contain all of those updated values. Yes, Levant. Handle change and handle submit, that's just a conventional name that we use. They're functions. We can call them whatever we want, but we often call the function we're giving to the event handler our handle function. So for on change, this is handle change. For on submit, this is handle submit. I could call this something more semantic, like maybe submit person. You know, maybe that feels better to me. But the generic default name we have for these is going to be handle submit. Yes, Greg. When we do the spread operator, we're creating essentially a copy of that object, and then we can also add new values to the right of it. And when the object sees multiple values for that key, it is going to choose the rightmost value. So if you aren't using a REPL as you code and you have these questions, I think you're really missing out. A great part about coding that I love compared to math is that the computer will tell me if I'm doing it right. So use the REPL in your browser, open up a REPLit, use the REPL in your text editor, whatever you want, and let's see how this spread operator works. So I'm going to create an object with A as 1 and B as 2. And you might have seen me do this a couple times. So now we have this object. I can create a copy of this object using the spread operator. So inside a new set of curly braces, I'm going to do ... object. And that's going to create a copy of my object. We can see that it's a copy because if I do does object equal object, I get true. Does object equal a copy of itself? No, because they're different objects. I can also add new keys to this. So I can do ... object to spread the key value pairs of that object into this new object. And then I am going to add another key. C is 3. I can also overwrite existing keys. So B is now 3. Yes, Scott, we are going to get to the edit functionality. I am just going to finish this up. Then we are going to implement routes. And then we're going to get editing going. So let's go back here. When we submit this form, I don't just want it to console log the object. I want it to add it to my list of people. So if we consult our diagram, this is when we need to pass in the setPeople function to our form so that we can use it during submission to add that person to that array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my form, I have my form up twice here. In app.js, I'm going to give my form the setPeople function as prompts. So I'm going to give this form setPeople. I'm going to give it the setPeople function. And then now within this form, I can access that via my prompts. I like to use destructuring, so I'm going to do that. So I'm going to grab my setPeople out of my prompts. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use this to add a person to the end of the people array. So when we submit, I'm going to use setPeople, and I want to add a person to the end of the people array. This is another great use case for the spread operator, because I can do ... people to spread that old array into a new array and then add values to the right. So there we go. I'm adding my person to a new copy of the people array on the end. But I'm getting an error. That's because people isn't defined in here. I didn't pass it down as a prop. I could go do that, and this would make it work. But we have this very convenient feature inside of our setter functions that we get from useState, which is instead of giving this a value that I want to set people to, I can give it a callback function. And setPeople will give my callback function the value of people, the current value of its associated state variable. Then it'll run my callback and use the value returned to set the new value of people. So this just avoids me having to pass another prop down. This will also make sure I'm using the most updated possible value for people. which is a nice side benefit. So now, if I add a person, I see some people talking in the Zoom chat. I can't really check that during this, so if you have questions, please put those in the Web21 After Party channel. So now, if I click Add Person, this person gets added to my list of people, and their card gets rendered. That's awesome. I also want to add some additional functionality. The stuff I've written is already here. I want to clear that out. One of the other benefits of writing these managed inputs is that it's very easy for me to change their values with my setPerson function. So I'm just going to reset them in here. So now, when we submit, it's going to clear all the values in our form. Jerry, what exactly in those last 3 minutes? The passing the function down via props? Is that what you'd like some clarification on?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we noticed in our diagram here that our form is going to keep track of its own person. But when we submit the form, we want to add that person to our array full of people. For it to do that, it needs some way to modify our array full of people. It needs to modify this value. Well, luckily, we have a function that's set up to do that. So we can pass that function down via props, which is how we pass data in React, to our form component, and then it can use that function to add the person to the array of people. So, inside of my app.js, I'm going to give my form component a prop called setPeople. And I'm going to give that prop a value, and it's going to be that setPeople function that I got from my use state. Now I can pull that function out of my props and form. I'm using destructuring here. This is the same as writing const setPeople is equal to props dot setPeople. Right? We're just grabbing a value out of props. The value of the prop is setPeople, what we defined on the left-hand side down here. So that's going to be the name of this key inside of the props object. And we can console log this to verify. So we can see the state object we're getting for the form has a value or a key called setPeople, and its value is a function. So then what I'm doing is I'm using that function setPeople inside of my submit handler, which is going to get fired when we submit our form. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a new array that copies the old values from our existing people array and adds a person to the end of that array. Now, I didn't pass people down as props. I could do that. I could do, people is equal to people and pass it down that way. But I don't really need to, because our setter functions that we get from useState have a very convenient feature where instead of giving it the value directly that we want to set their associated state variable to, we can give it a callback function. And setPeople will run the callback function and give it as an argument the value of its associated state variable. So setPeople is going to give me the value of that people array. And I can use that to return the new value that I want to set my state variable to, which is going to be the old array with person added on to the end of it. Does that make it a little bit more clear?
Yeah, Henry, regarding the setPeople setter function, you're passing in a callback because you're trying to give the most recent value of the state variable people.
Well, if I don't use it, I get an error message. People isn't declared inside of my form component. I don't have a variable called people anywhere. If I wanted the value of people, I could pass it in as a prop. I could do this. I could say, people is equal to my people array. And then I could grab that out of my props here. And that works. This is the pretty much the exact same thing. But I want to keep the number of props that I pass down. And this is a very convenient feature of the setter functions that I want people to see, where I can give set people a callback that it will run with the value of its associated variable as an argument, and then use its return value to set that variable. So this is a way for me to get access to people without passing it down as a prop. And that's neat. That's very useful.
But does the but passing it in as a callback function, does that give you a more recent version of the state variable?
It will make sure I have the most updated value of that state variable, because otherwise the value of this variable people is a constant value that's set when we render app. So there are cases where the value of this variable people might not actually equal the most updated value that set people has internally, because our updates are batched. We might be running things somewhere else that's going to change that value out from underneath us, and so that's an advantage here that we make sure we're getting the most updated value of people. This is something we needed to do when we did the timer stretch challenge way back on our first day in React. Here, I'm just mainly using it to get access to the people variable without passing it as a prop. So, Levon, I think there's some confusion happening with the name of our props. This is on the left-hand side of my equals sign. I can call this whatever I want. This is the name of my prop. And I'm setting its value to be the setPeople function that I have declared up here. If I wanted to, I could call this, setter function. And then inside of here, my prop would no longer be named setPeople. It would be called setter function. And this is the same as doing props.setter function. This is just using our destructuring syntax. Right, this is the key name, and I'm just saving it into a variable with the same name, and then we would call it with setter function. We can name our props whatever we want, but I have to give them as value what we want them to have as a value. I'm choosing to keep these names the same because while it might be confusing, it's also helpful that we don't lose track of what this means. This is indeed our setPerson function. Although I could rename that key, that prop name, to whatever I want. Okay, so I want to move on here. I want to get to the edit functionality. So the way we have this now isn't the way that I like to write these kind of components. Sorry, this should be setPeople. I don't like giving my form. Okay, Greg, what would happen if I didn't have these curly braces around setPeople here would be that I'm making a variable called setPeople, and I'm setting its value equal to my props object. When I add my curly braces on the left-hand side, I'm performing destructuring, the same way that I'm performing destructuring here. When I'm setting my variable names from useState, because useState returns an array that's going to have my variable's value in the first position and a function in the second position. So I use destructuring for that. Here, I'm using destructuring to grab the value of the key setPeople and save it into a variable called setPeople. This is literally equivalent to me doing const setPeople is equal to props.setPeople. These are the same thing. I'm just grabbing the value of the setPeople key out of props and saving it into a variable. All right, so I don't like doing what I did down here. I don't like giving form direct access to my setPeople function. And the reason is because it makes my form component have to be smarter. I have to write this code within my form component. So now form has to be aware of how I've stored this data, and has to know the data structure, that this is an array, and it has to figure out how to add things to the end of that array. I don't think that's something my form should really be concerned about. What I want is when I submit my form for it to call some function and give it the new person. As far as it knowing how to actually add that person to the array, I don't think that should be part of its purview. I don't think that should be its responsibility. And when we write dumber components, it allows us to reuse them in multiple places. And this is actually going to be pivotal for us to be able to reuse this component for editing. There are ways to make it work without doing it this way, but I think this is a lot cleaner. This is also scary to me, to see this form component that just gets my setPeople function. Because if I'm just looking in my app.js, suddenly I have to be concerned. What is form doing to my value of people? It could erase it. It could turn it into an entirely new data structure. It can do anything it wants to that. And now I have to go read the source code of the form component to figure out what it does. And next week, when you're collaborating with people on build weeks, you're not going to be able to write every component. You're not going to know what's going on in every component. And if you can figure it out by just looking inside of app.js or wherever else without having to go read the entirety of that component, that brings us a lot of value as developers to be able to see that here and not have to worry about the entire implementation. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to declare a function inside of my app component called addPerson. And it's going to take a person, and what it's going to do is it's going to write that code. It's going to call setPeople. It's going to copy our people array, and then it's going to add that person onto the end. And look, I don't have to worry about doing my weird function thing in here. Yeah, I just wanted to show you how to do that. It's not actually necessary. Because now I can pass this as a prop instead of my setPeople function directly. And here I'm going to give it a different name. And this is with the power of foresight when we get to editing. So I'm going to give it this prop called, what do I want to call this? Let's call it submit person. Because this is the function that I want to run when I'm submitting, and I want to give it the person that I currently have. I'm going to give it my addPerson function. Does my form know that this adds a person? Nope. Does it know how that works? Not one bit. It just knows that I've given it a function, and it should call that with the value of person. So now what I'm going to do in here, instead of getting my setPeople out of props, I'm going to get my submitPerson function. And instead of worrying about the implementation of everything, I'm just going to call submitPerson on my person object. And now my form is dumber for this and all the more valuable. Because this is still going to work. When I click add, we're going to get that additional person card. But now form doesn't know how that works. It doesn't know that we're adding. If we need to change the value of this prop to be a function that, say, edits the value of an existing person, we can do that. And form literally won't know the difference. It's so valuable to write these dumb, reusable components that don't contain logic that's really outside of their world. This is a much more maintainable, much more readable solution, because now I know from looking at my form in app.js, I can see what it can do. The only thing it can do to my people array is to add a new person on the end. Now I don't have to go read the source code of form. I know what it does. I know the only thing it can do. That's a huge, huge gain for me as a developer, that now I don't have to go and read this entire component. I know what this component does. It adds a person when you submit it. Wonderful. And now I can change that functionality when we do editing. So to do editing, We can manage this all in state, but I want us to get a little bit more practice with routes. And I know I've gone over into your project time. I'm going to keep this running. If you want to go get started on your project today, I'm going to be posting the recording of this afterwards, and you can review it there. But I'm going to keep going for anyone who does want to stay and for the video later. So now I want to use routes because I want to have my form do multiple things. I don't want to write a new component. I want to have a form that can add people, and I also want to have a form that can edit people. So we need to put some kind of conditional logic in here. And we can do this by setting state variables and writing if-elses and all of this. And that's one perfectly valid solution. But routes offer us another avenue of writing conditional code in React, which is that we can associate code with different URLs. So I'm going to set up 3 pages. One where we can view our cards, one where we can add a person, and one where we can edit a person. And this, in my mind, helps me kind of delineate the responsibilities and build my form component to be reusable, not just for it to have a bunch of conditional logic within it. And I think that offers me a lot of value in the way I'm going to approach this problem in the future. So I'm going to go back to my terminal, and I'm going to kill this server, and I'm going to do yarn add react router DOM, which I think I may have already done, but it can't hurt. So we're going to download and install React Router DOM, and then we're going to hook up our application to the router, and we're going to put in some routes and get our adding person working, and then we're going to do our editing. So while this is running, does anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah, Henry. I kind of understood what you were saying about not passing to your form component the actual setter function, but I still don't see the benefit of wrapping that setter function in another function and then doing it that way. I don't see any like tangible difference between.
Well, we're about to see a huge gain, which is that when we write our form component that's going to handle editing, I can give it, instead of the add person function, I can give it a new function I've defined called edit person. And form won't know the difference. All it knows is it has to run that function and give it a person. I can swap out the functionality of this on the fly.
I see. You can just swap it. It makes sense. Yeah.
But this also, naming my code, right? This is basically a form of documentation. I know that when I submit a person in my form, this component is going to add that person. So now I know what this component does. It doesn't just have carte blanche access to set the value of people to be whatever it wants. Now I know that when we submit it, it adds a person. And that helps me as a dev looking at someone else's code or looking at my own code to know what's going on. Okay, so now I've added React Router DOM. To set this up, we need to go into index.js. We're going to need to import browser router as router from React Router DOM, and I'm going to wrap my app component in that router. That's just going to hook it up so that I can have routes inside of here. And nothing has changed, but now we can use routes. So I'm going to flip back into app.js, and I am going to import my route from React Router DOM, but I'm also going to import link, because I'm just going to spin up a quick nav component. So React Router DOM. I'm going to set up some links here. I'm going to have one that's going to take us back home, which is just going to be at slash. Then I'm going to have another that's going to take us to add. And that's where my form is going to live. And why did it not like this? Oop. I need to do this inside of this div. The joys of live coding. So now I have these links, and it changes my route. We can see my URL changes when I click on these. But right now I don't have any routes set up. So what I want to do is I want to add a route on home. So route path is equal to my top level slash. I'm also going to add exact to this so it only renders on that route. And then I need to give it a component. This is where it might have been nice if we had written a card list component that I could just hand off to this route, but I haven't done that. So I'm going to give it a render prop, and this is going to take in props. I'm actually not going to do anything with them here because I don't really need them. And then I am going to create my array of cards. So now what I've done is I've given this route on home a render function that will create all of my card components. So when I flip over to add, we can see that that disappears. Awesome. Any questions with what I did here? All right. What was I just clicking? I was just clicking these links that I added to the top of my page that take me home and take me to add. Okay. So now I want to set up the route for add. So I'm going to write my route. The path is going to be add. And the render function, because this time I do have a component called form, but form has to take additional props, and we use this render prop on route to make our components take additional props. So I'm going to get my props. I'm going to render my form component, and then I'm also going to pass it these props that the route wants to give to my form component. And let me just format this a little bit nicer. There we go. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking these props that the route's trying to give us, which is going to be those history, location, and match values, and I'm giving them as props to my form. I'm not going to use them just yet. If we have time at the end, I'll show how we can use the form submission to navigate back home. Because for now, the way this is going to work is if I flip over to add person, now it shows me my form. And if I add a name, email, and a role, and then add this person, I stay on this page. It clears the form, but I have to click on home to go and see the new card that I had added.
Henry, where is the code to clear your form? Did you have to manually type that,
Yep.
or did it automatically?
That is right here, inside of my handle submit function, the function I'm running whenever I submit the form. I'm calling setPerson, and I'm just resetting all of the values that are tied to my inputs. And that's how I clear the form. Okay, so now add person is working, and we have our routes set up. Now I want to talk about editing. So in order to edit a person, we're going to need some way of identifying which person we're editing. And this is the reason why I chose to implement this with routes, is because when we were working with the movies project the other day, all of our movies had an ID. 0, 1, 2, 3, you know, The Godfather, I think, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. And we could use that ID from our URL to go and get that movie's value and display it. Here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to give each one of my people, each individual person, an ID, and I'm going to use that in the URL in order to grab their data and edit them. So, I can give Henry and Bart IDs manually here. I'm going to give it an ID of 0 and an ID of 1, and that's going to work. And I can add a link to that card. So I'm going to go into card.js. I'm going to import link from React Router DOM. Then I'm going to add a link to the bottom of this card. Call it edit. And this is going to link to some JavaScript. So in curly braces, I'm going to write a template string that links to /edit/ that person's ID. So now, if I go to home, I have my edit buttons. And when I click edit for Henry, I'm going to go to /edit/0. So now I have a way of knowing which person I want to edit. I still have to figure out how to get that data, but that's something that an API might make it very easy for us to do. Like on the movies project, we would just query the API, /API/movies/ that ID. Here, we're going to have to do some legwork ourselves, but this is a pattern that we're going to see frequently when we start working more closely with APIs. And I want to make sure we have a little bit of exposure to it while I can. So now if I click edit for my dad, we see we get a 1 there. The problem is, when I add a person, name, email, and role, add that person, and we click edit, their ID is undefined. We haven't given them an ID. So what we have to do is we have to assign each person a new ID. And there's a lot of ways to do this. We could have some mutable variable that keeps track of IDs and increment it to make sure we're always getting a new one. I'm going to use a fun function we have in JavaScript. Yes, Dan, date.now, which is a function that will give us the number of milliseconds since 1970. That's how time actually works on our computer. And we're actually going to hit a number of milliseconds pretty soon that's going to be too large to fit inside of a 32-bit computer's number. And that's going to be a big problem. Yay! But we can ignore that for now and assume that people are going to fix that for us when it happens. So date.now is going to give us the number of milliseconds that have passed. And we can be reasonably sure that we're not going to be able to add 2 people during the same millisecond of time, so those IDs are going to be unique. There's a bunch of other ways of generating unique IDs. This is just the fastest. But now we have a wonderful benefit of the way I've structured my app. Because where is my logic to add a person? It's inside of app.js. It's not inside of form. So I've changed slightly the structure of my person. Does the form need to be aware of that? No, it does not. The form is dumb. The form doesn't know. I can write this logic inside of app.js. And that's so nice for me. I love this because my form gets to stay dumb. So what I can do for this add person function is I can use our old tricks. I can make a new copy of this person object, and I can give it an ID with its value being date.now. So now, when I go and add a person, name, email, role, another thing, if you hit enter in a form, that's also going to fire a submit event. And if I go home, we have our new person, and when I click edit, they now have this wonderful ID. Beautiful. Beautiful.
So, quick question, Henry. For you initialized your people, Henry and your father, to have ID of 0 and 1.
Yeah.
But then you're setting the ID for all of the other people that you add with that date.now. That's what you did?
Yes. And it doesn't really matter. The IDs just need to be unique. It's helpful if they're all the same type of data. That way you can be sure that your operations on them are going to line up. But it doesn't matter that we jump from IDs of 1 to an ID of, I don't know what unit that is, trillions. But this is guaranteed to be different than 0 or 1 because we're not in the 1970s. And so I'm going to have unique IDs. That's all I need.
What do you think about using like a math.rand, like between 0 and 10.
I would not use math.rand because that is not guaranteed to give me a unique value. The odds of having what we'd call a collision, where we have two IDs of the same value, would be pretty low, but not as low as we think, because that rand is a pseudo-random number generator, so it's actually predictable. They're not truly random numbers. If we generated enough random numbers, we would actually loop back to the start and start getting the same sequence of random numbers. There are ways of generating random IDs. A UUID is very common. It's a universally unique identifier that's generated with a special algorithm, and it's 128 bits long. They look like this. If you pay attention, you'll see them, in other code and websites, and they're essentially random. And there's so many of them that the odds of you getting a collision, two of the same UUID, are just astronomically low, to the point where we can disregard it entirely. So don't use math.rand. If you want random IDs, use a function to generate UUIDs.
Henry, could we set the ID to be equal to the index in the array?
Yes, we could do that. I thank you for bringing this up. This was an option that I wanted to mention. Instead of using these hard-coded values for ID, we could use the index of the position of each of these in the array, which we can grab from our map. But I don't like doing that because those index values can change. What happens if, while I'm editing a person, some other operation within my application deleted a person from the array? Suddenly my indexes are going to be off, and now my application can edit the wrong user when I submit them. So using indexes here would work very well, but I want to introduce this idea of these ID values inside of these objects, because when we use practically any API for each resource, for each object like a person, they're probably going to have a value in there called ID that's going to be unique to those resources, and it's good to get in the habit of using them the same way we did on the movies project. So that's just the way I chose to do it. You also could have used indexes. Okay, so now I want to get this edit to bring up a form. So let's add that route. So I want to make a route. For the path, I want it to equal /edit/:ID. I'm going to want the value of that ID. And then I'm going to want it to render a form. And I'm going to use the render rather than the component because I know I'm going to need to pass props into my form. But for now, I'm just going to give it the props that route wants it to have. So now when I go here, I get this form. I need to do two things. I need to write a replacement for add person. I want to give it a value of submit person such that when it submits, it will go out and it will edit the person in my array. And I'm also going to need to give it some initial values to populate this form. I'm going to do that first. So this is what Dan meant when yesterday he was like, gotta Google some stuff. Because for the sake of argument in this program, we haven't seen directly how to find a single element out of an array. And there's lots of methods we could use that we do know to do that. But I want to look up the best way to do that. So I'm just going to Google JavaScript find elements in an array. And I'm going to spell it correctly. And look at Google. They know. They literally know what the answer to this question is. And that's because arrays have a find method. And I'm going to go to MDN because I like their examples better. But we can call find on an array, and it will run our callback function, and it will return the first element where that callback returns true. Find is basically filter, but it gives you the first match instead of all of the matches. So this is what we're going to use to be able to find the person out of our array of people. Now, another cool thing is that, you know, we might have instead used a different data structure than an array for this. We might have used an object where the keys are their IDs, and we can look them up that way. That's one of the advantages of writing add person inside of app.js. If this data structure changes, form won't know the difference. But for now, I'm going to stick to it being an array, and I'm going to use that find method. So I'm going to, inside of this render function, take a look at these props I'm getting. And this is a little bit weird. And this might be where we would write this inside of another component, but I'm just going to do it inline here. So I'm going to console log the props and return this form. So when we render this, I'm going to see my props object in my console. And that's going to be right here. Let me see if that's showing up in the recording. Yeah, that's good enough. So I'm going to see my props object right here. And inside of this match, I'm going to have the params object, which is going to have a key of ID that's equal to 0. So I can use this right here. So let's do people.find, because I want to find a person. I'm going to write a callback that's going to take a person, and it's going to check if that person's ID is equal to my props.match.params.id, the ID from my URL. In this case, it's going to be 0. And why don't I console log the result? And let me format that a little bit nicer. Let's see what happens. I get undefined. Does anyone know why I got undefined? Very subtle thing that's happening here.
Are you not on the proper page?
Nope. This is totally fine. We can see this props object that we're getting here. Yes, Catherine, perfect. If we look inside of props.match.params, the value of this ID is 0. Whenever we get these values out of our URL, they're going to be strings. The URL is just a big string, and the data type that I set my IDs to are all numbers. So that's what's going wrong. So what we can do is turn our ID number into a string. Now, I actually get that object. I'm going to get Henry. Alright, that's pretty neat. Another thing I could have done is we've always, up until this point, we've used triple equals. And that checks if two things are exactly the same. If we do double equals, JavaScript is a bit looser with the rules on this. And it'll see, on one side I have a number 0, on the other side I have a string that's 0. Close enough. And we generally try to avoid using this double equals because sometimes JavaScript will do weird type conversions and be like, yeah, those are the same. And they're not, really. And so we can get bugs in our code. That's why I'm going to prefer to be explicit here, use my triple equals and toString. I could have also parsed the right side into a number, but that's more computationally expensive, I assume. Okay, so now we have our ability to find the person that we're editing. I'm going to save that into a variable. Call it person here. I'm going to give this as a prompt to my form. And I'm going to call it initial person. Now, if we look inside of our form object, I'm going to remove this console log. If we were to look inside of our form component, we would now be receiving this initial person as prompts. And we're console logging that here. We can see that we're getting this value of initial person. Right? We're getting the value of me, person 0. What we can do is we can use this to set the initial value of our person with useState. Another great benefit of writing managed forms. Very easy to set their values using JavaScript. So I can grab that person out of my props. Oh, I've run into a name collision. Or I'm sorry, my initial person out of these props. Now I don't have a name collision. And I can set the value of useState to be my initial person. And I'm going to do this wrong the first time, because I want to show you what happens. So I'm going to set this equal to the initial person. Did I spell this wrong? Yes, I did. Initial person. So now it works. It worked. It doesn't seem wrong. When I go to edit/0, I find the person with the ID of 0, and I give it to my form as a prompt, and then I'm setting the initial value of all of my inputs to be this person. But if I go to add person, I get an error. And that's because we don't give it a value of initial person. So that's going to be undefined. And then when I try to do undefined.name, I get an error. So what we can do is we can write some logic in here that will use initial person if it is defined. But if it isn't, we can use our default empty object here. What we can do is use the OR operator. The reason that this is undefined, to answer your question, is that when I'm in the add page, we're rendering this route. And here, I'm not giving a form a prop called initial person. So it's going to be undefined. When I'm on my edit route, I am giving my form a prop of initial person. But I've made my edit work, I've broken my add. Let me see what you typed. Ah, great. So we can use the OR operator. And let me pull up my REPL. Again, if you're not using a REPL while you're coding, I think you're missing it out. This is a great way to test what you're trying to do. The way OR works is it checks two values. The way logical OR works is if one is true, then the OR is true. If neither are true, then the OR is false. If both are true, the OR is true. But the way this is going to work is if we do null or null, we're going to get null. If I do true or null, we're going to get true, because OR is going to see that this left-hand value is true, and it's going to say, that's good enough for me, I'll return that value. And I could set this equal to any other truthy value. And it will give me back the left-hand side. But if the left-hand side is null or false or undefined, all falsy values, then it will give me the right-hand side. So we can use this to use the initial person, or if it's not defined, our default object here. There we go. Oh, Virginia, a REPL is something we haven't directly talked about. No need to be embarrassed. A REPL stands for Read, Evaluate, Print, Loop. So what we do here is we type in code. It reads the code. It evaluates it. We get 2. It prints out the value, and then it repeats. That's what we call a REPL. It's just a little interactive place where we can type code, see it evaluated. Very useful for our scripting languages, our interpreted languages like JavaScript. Okay, so now I haven't broken my AND, because in the case that initial person isn't defined, we get to fall back to our old object here. And there's more ways of doing this. Again, we're starting to open up into the world of an infinite number of possible solutions. So I'm going to go back to my app.js, because if I go and I edit a person, and I click add person, nothing happens. because I haven't given my form when I'm editing a submit person function. And this is where we get the great value of making our form dumb. I don't have to change the code within the form. I can just give it a new function. So I'm going to steal this code. I'm going to write a new function called edit person that takes in, I'm going to call it an edited person. And what we're going to do is we're going to do something weird here. There's more ways of solving this problem. But again, this is a point where we need to turn to Google, because I don't know how to edit an object inside of an array. But I can guarantee you I am not the first person on the internet that has wanted to do that in JavaScript. So we could turn to Google and we could say JS edit an object inside of an array. And the internet is going to tell us. There's going to be a lot of solutions to this problem. But if you look through this Stack Overflow or any of the other things, there will be a solution that works. Here they're using find index, which is a version of find that returns the index of that thing. I'm just going to keep using find because I want to show you a cool thing we can do with it. But there's lots of ways of doing this. This is where we want to use Google when we have a very well-defined problem at hand. How do I edit an object inside an array? Boom. How many results do we have? Yeah, we have 16 million results, right? Not the first person to do this. These are the good Googleable questions. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue writing my edit person. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a copy of my people array. The reason I do this is I'm about to modify this array. I don't ever want to directly modify my state variables. Whenever I want to change my state variable, I need to use that set function. So when we start doing operations that involve mutation, that involve changing values within our state variable, we should make a copy, make our changes in the copy, and then run the set function on the copy. So I'm going to make a people copy. I'm going to search people copy using find to find a person where their ID is equal to the ID of my edited person object that I'm getting back from my form when I submit it. So I'm going to check and see if those IDs are equal, and I'm going to save this in a variable called old person. Now this gives me a reference to that object, old person. So let me console log old person. I'm also going to console log edited person, and we're going to see what's happening here. So I'm going to go down to where I'm rendering my edit form, and I'm going to give it as a value to the submit person prop, my edit person function. Now what this is going to do is when I go and I edit me, and I change some value in here, and I run add person. I do have a Twitter. I am twitter.com/HenryBlevins. I don't use it. So when I click add person, it's going to run this edit person function. So now I see what's happened here. I get these two objects. My new person that has my updated name in there, and my old person, which is the person that I've found from the old people array. All right, this is my updated one. This is my new one. If I want, I can, inside of this function, I'm going to give this a bit of a bigger view. I can edit the values of old person I can set the old person's name equal to my edited person's name. Do the same for email, and do the same for role. And now I can call set people on my people copy array. What this is going to do is when I set the values of this old person object, this is the same object that's somewhere inside of my array. So when I update the values of this object, when that object appears in my array, it's going to have those modified values. So this is where we're performing mutation. I want to do it on a copy of my array. I don't want to do it on it directly. And if Patrick is here, he might point out that this solution is not complete because we're not doing a deep copy, but I'm ignoring that problem for now. But let's check and see if this works. So I'm going to go home. I'm going to edit Henry. I get my pre-populated Henry stuff. Someone earlier called me Lord Henry. They were ill-informed. I'm actually a Duke. I'm going to click Add Person. We're going to go back to home. I have edited a person. I have just edited a value with a form. And it only took an hour and a half. Brilliant. Wonderful. So, questions about this? We're not quite done yet as well.
So, going through the logic in your edit person, you're creating a copy of the people array, which is stored in the state, and then you're creating an old person, and that's going to be the results of finding the person in the array, the matching to the edited person. But the thing is, you're not. When are you updating the old person to the actual people array?
So when we get old person out of this array, we're not making a new variable. This variable is just going to be a reference to the object inside of my people copy array. We're not making a new copy of it, we're just getting a reference to that variable. The same way that if I pull up my REPL and I make an object that has a value of a equals 1, and then I make a, another object equal to my first object variable, and I set other.a equal to 2. Well, now other's going to have that updated value, but guess what? So is object. Because this just creates a reference to this object. This doesn't create a brand new object for me. That's why we do things like our spread operator. Because now, if I do other.a equals 4, other's going to have a value of 4, and object is going to be unchanged. So that's what's happening there. What we can also do, instead of writing this out line by line, which smell test as devs, we're repeating ourselves, there's got to be a better way to do this. This is something you can Google as well. There's a function in JavaScript called object.assign. And it will take the first object we give it and any other objects, and it will smash all the values from the other objects into the first one and update them. So I can assign inside of my old person object all the values from my edited person. And that'll do the same thing as this, but if we add any more fields, those will get picked up along the way. So go into edit, TL to the max. Click this, go to home, and now that's been updated. Is there a way to use the spread instead of assign? Well, spreading is going to make a copy, and we don't want to do that. We want to update the value in old person. Another way that might be more clear what we're doing here is we could do something like this. Instead of getting that object directly, we can use find index. What this does is instead of returning the first item, the first element in our array that matches, it's going to return the index of that matching element. So this is going to return 0. So now I can write people copy at 0 is going to be equal to my edited person. And that'll also work. I assume I didn't test this one. Yep, that works. So that's another way of doing it. Just wanted to show you some different solutions to this problem, because you're going to run into a lot of them. When you start Googling these, Stack Overflow is going to have tons of answers, and they're all probably going to work, but they're all going to be different too. Okay, I want to do one last thing that was bugging me. Just when I click on edit, this still says add person. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my form a prop called button text. This is going to be add person. And this is going to be edit person. And guess what? This makes my component dumber. So now, inside of my form component, I can grab the button text from my props, and I can use that as the value of the text inside this button. Now it's going to say edit person here and add person there. Wonderful. What about using splice after finding the index of the objects to replace? Bad solution? Nope. That's just another solution. I would prefer to use find or find index because I feel like it's a bit more deliberate. You know, when we're reading the names of the functions we're using, it sounds a bit more like how we would describe the process in English, but splice is another option to change the value of items inside an array. I don't know the implementation. That might be slightly more inefficient than this, but I am no expert. Okay, so before we wrap, anyone that wants to see, I want to show how we can use navigation when we submit our forms. And that's done inside of our form component with the history prop. The route is going to give us this history object. So we can see right inside of here we have this object called history. And we're going to have a function called push. And if I give history.push a value that I want to change my URL to, then I'm going to navigate there. So what I can do, I can grab my history object out of my props. And then once I'm done submitting and doing all of the good things I need to do here, I can call history.push and navigate back to my home. Now, when I add a person and I hit enter, there we go. Just a navigation without using a link. And that is with the history object that route gives us in our props. Very cool stuff. Yes, I will. I'll post this solution right now. While I'm doing this, any more questions about what I've done? This should have just been in master, right? Yep. Eli just said that he managed to do it yesterday, but it was much uglier. This way it was very clear. Yeah, that's going to be the story of writing code. I am so eternally impressed by everyone here at Lambda School. Because I have experience before this. I used to write code in college. I did computational physics research. And I spent years just writing absolute dumpster fires of programs. Like things that if I look back at now, like I feel embarrassment like to the same degree of when I accidentally called my second grade teacher, Mr. Wittenberg, mom. Like it's that bad. And all of you are writing code that is so much better than that, given so much less time, and that's amazing. And so yes, our first solutions to these things are not always going to be ideal, especially when we're fumbling around in the dark a bit. But that fumbling is where we get so much value. We struggle, we learn how to solve problems. This was a bit overtuned, but that's okay. Some of the projects are going to be harder. Our goal should be to be working hard and trying to solve these problems, and sometimes we're not always going to get there on the MVP, but the value is in the work, not necessarily the result. So, yeah. And I solved this myself yesterday very quickly, and it was also much uglier. And then today I sat down and I thought about how I want to approach this to make it a bit cleaner. There are still some rough edges that could be improved, but what are you going to do? All right, Catherine has a question. The state is initialized with the data you gave. Could you initialize the state with empty values, like name is an empty string? Do you mean inside of app.js where I have my sample people? Because I don't need these. I just put them here so I'd have people to edit when my browser refreshed, so I wouldn't have to constantly be adding a person to go and edit them. More than likely, if we wrote this application, there wouldn't be any hard-coded values here, and we would just, you know, have to add people as we needed them, and then we can edit these as well. But I don't know if that's what you're asking. You might be asking about the state inside of form, where we are setting these to empty values if we're not getting an initial person.
No, thank you. That's right. But then if you have an initial key as like a number,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because with a string, you do like the parentheses or the, you can do a string, but if you wanted some initial, like a function, you can make an empty function. Then what would you do for like a number or like a float or something?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't entirely understand.
So in the form here,
Oh, okay.
you have the use state with the name, empty string, email, empty string. But if you had like, if you wanted to physically assign like a key as a number, what would you leave the number like initially?
So you could make it equal to 0 or an empty string or something. It just can't be undefined. If it is undefined, React won't know that you're trying to manage that. And let me see, because I think the value we get out of inputs, even if they're set to be numbers, is still strings. But let me check. So I'm going to make a new input, give it a name of number and a type of number, and the value is going to be person.number. There's a lot of value in playing around with these things. And I'm going to set the initial value of number to be, let's see what happens if I give it an empty string. And then inside of my handle change, I'm going to console log this, this person. And I'm going to comment out this. So let's see what happens. I go into add person, we get a number. Yep, number is actually a string. All of I wasn't sure if React would do parsing for us, because inside of HTML, the only data structure that we have is a string. Everything's just a string. So even though this is in the format of a number, you know, if I type letters, React is correctly not treating those as proper input. But the value of that is still going to be a string that we will have to parse into a number ourselves. So generally, empty strings are a good way to go. Just can't let it be undefined. If we set it equal to 0, React would have correctly translated that back into a string when it came time to set the form field. A couple more questions. Well, thank you so much, Adnan. I'm glad this helped. If multiple people are adding at the same time in the app, could date.now be the same? It could, but they would each, in every tab of this application, they each have their own individual state. So it wouldn't matter insofar as we're doing this inside of the app. If we're interacting with an API and we're setting IDs in there, we probably don't want to use date.now, because then we have what's called a, well, it wouldn't technically be a race condition, but if two people did the same thing at the same time, then we get the same IDs. Our IDs are actually going to be handled very nicely for us by a SQL server when we get to the backend. So we don't have to worry about manually generating those IDs too much. Yeah, and it is possible. Something that on an old project we ran into issues with is it told us to, you know, make some sample things and set the IDs equal to date.now. If I sent these both to date.now, these are going to run within the same millisecond of my code, and those are going to be the same. If I go here, we see edit ends in 20 and edit ends in 20. And if I click on edit for my dad, we get me, because those have the same ID. So we do have to be careful about that. Oh, I'm sorry, Faye. Did I lose a question in the Slack? Oh, yes, I saw this earlier, about the square brackets inside of this. Okay. That's just bracket notation, right? We've seen it in objects, but technically everything in JS is an object, so it will still work. So it still works for brackets event.target.name because name is a property of the input object. So that is for accessors. I don't know exactly how this is implemented, but yes, we are using that very similar syntax of accessors here. I would hazard that it's actually different because of the way that JavaScript parses the objects. We're not actually using that operator, right? Because the square brackets, those actually like use a member function that is on, you know, the object class. But JavaScript allows us to use this special square bracket syntax as the accessor operator, just like we have other operators like addition and subtraction, because that's something we do frequently. Here, we're not accessing anything. I believe this is just syntax so that when it's parsing the name of these keys, when it sees square brackets, it knows not to expect a literal value, but to instead expect to use the value of the variable found within those square brackets. So that would be my assumption of how that works. And they use square brackets because it allows us to visually connect it to the property accessor operator. But I believe they're exclusive things. All right. Any other questions? No, I'm not seeing any typing. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm sorry that I took up a bit of extra time in your project this afternoon. You know, I wish you a lot of luck on that. Feel free to reach out to me if you need help. But thank you all so much for coming. I will get the recording of this posted.